Now, as far as they're aware, that the grommet had fallen out of the eardrum, had migrated naturally out of the ear. So you can see the wax is really, really deep, right up against the patient's eardrum. We call this medial impacted earwax, and it's beyond the isthmus, so 0.5 centimetre away from the eardrum. You get a natural narrowing of the ear canal. You can probably see that narrowing. And then the ear canal widens again. And that causes there to be a recess, so a trench, both at the bottom of the ear canal, near the eardrum. We call that the inferior recess. And also to the left-hand side, in the case of the left ear, we call that the anterior recess. Now, this patient's ear, if you've been watching loads of my videos, you can probably appreciate and acknowledge just how narrow this patient's ear is. It's extremely narrow. The entrance is also very, very bendy. And this isthmus, this narrowing, is very pronounced. So after this narrowing, the ear canal then suddenly widens again, and it's a real trench here at the bottom of the ear canal. It's almost like a downward slope, like a ski slope. Beyond this, you can see the bottom there, the canal just before the wax. If you go over that, it's almost like a mountain hill, a mountain top, the summit almost, and then it goes suddenly back down, which makes it really, really hard to remove this. Now, initially I used a standard Zollner suction probe, but it only just fitted into the ear canal. You can see there's very, very little space there. And because there's a lot of keratin here as well, we experience a lot of clarinetting with the full suction probes. That's when the skin vibrates violently at the tip of the suction probe, and it emits a very loud high-frequency squeal. So I've had to go back in with a fine end to stop that clarinetting. And you can see I'm just gently working away at this impaction. And I've just revealed the grommet. You can just see the grommet here, the white object. Now, you can only see half the grommet because the other grommet's in the trench. It's in the basin, which is going to be really, really tricky to remove. So, and it's the dead skin and wax has almost entangled itself around this grommet, and it's keeping the grommet in place. So I'm just trying to gently loosen this skin off the posterior canal wall. But it is a bit of a tight squeeze in here. It's really, really narrow. It makes it really difficult to just manoeuvre the fine end to make those little wriggle movements that you normally would see in my videos to detach it. The patient was also experiencing the gag reflex when we're in the ear. So you can just see the top part of the eardrum there, but that grommet is lodged. Can't use any other instrumentation. So with forceps, for example, the bottom jaw of the forceps would clip both the bottom part of the ear canal and also the left-hand side of the ear canal if I went in there, because I would need to get the bottom jaw into that opening, the middle part of the grommet. You can see there's an opening there. It's just not possible, and it's too deep to use an ear hook. There's not enough space in the ear canal to get in and behind, actually. And again, I hope you can. So I think I've just gone back in with a full Zollner suction probe here just to see if I can use extra pat suction now to remove this grommet. It just about fits in there. We're really, really close up against the side of the ear canal. Now, I've cleared most of the debris. The eardrum's visible. The patient still has glue ear, by the way, and I'll come back to what glue ear is in a moment. Now, so what I've told the patient, we're going to leave that. Now, I do go back to that ear, so stay tuned. Don't turn away. I've purposely told the patient, let's just deal with the right ear because that's still quite complex, removing that grommet. And I wanted to just get the right ear cleared and then go back to that. So we've paused that left ear, and I'm now into the right ear. And again, the patient that's got a really narrow, twisty ear canal. You can see we're going to the left, and it's really impacted. You can see the mark the patient's made with their Q-tip, the cotton bud. It's really pushed the wax really in, and because the patient's got a narrow ear canal already, and they've got this really narrow isthmus, it's really large. It's really tricky, this, to remove. There's a few hairs there that the patient has also squashed in. You're just going to see me trying to lift this off the bottom of the ear canal and loosen it. I'm going to have to put some drops in a moment. So whilst you're watching this, I'm just going to explain to you what a grommet is and why a grommet is used and inserted by ENT doctors. So behind the eardrum, we have what we call the middle ear cavity. The middle ear cavity should be air-filled, and the air pressure in the middle ear should be equal to the atmospheric air pressure. And when the air pressure either side of the eardrum is equal, that's when we hear the best. That's when the eardrum is most mobile and compliant. What regulates the air pressure and equalises the air pressure in the middle ear is a tube called the eustachian tube. It's a narrow orifice that connects the middle ear cavity to the back of the nose, the nasopharynx. the eustachian tube is typically closed, and it's normally closed to prevent upper respiratory tract infections travelling up the eustachian tube and entering the middle ear. And also the eustachian tube is typically closed because it prevents our own voice or internal sounds travelling up the eustachian tube and hitting the eardrum on the underside. So instead of the sounds hitting the eardrum through the ear canal, sounds can also travel up the eustachian tube and bounce off the eardrum internally on the inside, and which means you'll hear your own voice all the time, and you'll hear your internal respiratory sounds all the time. So the eustachian tube is normally shut, and during brief moments of yawning, swallowing or chewing, it opens itself up, and during those brief moments where it opens, the air pressure is equalised. So we're always hearing optimally. Now, in some people, that eustachian tube can get blocked, and it typically gets blocked at the back of the nose. What causes the eustachian tube to be blocked? There's many things. You could have an anatomically very narrow eustachian tube. You could have congestion, edema, swelling at the back of the nose where the eustachian tube is. Conditions such as rhinitis, sinusitis, enlarged adenoids, turbinates in the ear, deviated septum. Any nasal congestion really at the back of the nose can cause that eustachian tube to be blocked. There's also muscles either side of the eustachian tube, and it's when those muscles contract that the eustachian tube opens. So it could be weakened muscles of the eustachian tube. So they're just some reasons. And when the eustachian tube is blocked, it means there's no air behind the eardrum. There's no air that can enter in the middle ear cavity, which then creates a vacuum, a suction effect, and the eardrum gets sucked in, a bit like when you're on the aeroplane. Now, the eustachian tube also acts as a drain pipe, so any fluid that normally is secreted in the middle ear fluid is normally drained out of the middle ear cavity via the eustachian tube. But if that eustachian tube is blocked, then you then get a build-up of fluid, and this fluid builds up. We call it effusion. This effusion builds up behind the eardrum. Eventually, instead of the middle ear cavity being air-filled, it's then full of fluid, which means the eardrum doesn't vibrate anymore. And eventually that fluid can get infected and become thicker in viscosity, in texture, consistency, similar to glue, hence why we call it glue ear. And eventually, as the fluid continues to build up, it's almost like if you put water in a water balloon and you don't stop, eventually that balloon's going to burst. And similarly, if this fluid continues to build up behind the eardrum, it's going to perforate through the eardrum and you get discharge and you get a perforation. So what a grommet is, an ENT doctor, if you've got a blocked eustachian tube, they insert, they use a scalpel and they kind of cut through the eardrum. If you've got some glue ear there, they then use the suction probe to suck the fluid out through the eardrum, and they put this ventilation tube, a grommet. So the grommet, so I'll come back to that. So this is the patient's right ear. You can just see how narrow that is, and you can see how we managed to remove it. You can see that isthmus, the ear canal really narrows very deep in the ear, and it was really lodged against the drum, but I managed to remove it. So what the grommet does, it's a ventilation tube. So because the eustachian tube is blocked at the back of the nose and there's no air that can travel into the middle ear via the eustachian tube, a grommet is a substitute, it's a bypass. So air can instead travel through the ear canal into the middle ear. And if there's any fluid behind the eardrum, it can also sometimes trickle away out the grommet, out of the outer ear. So a grommet is a bypass, really. So it allows air to enter behind the eardrum in the middle ear via the ear canal if that eustachian tube is blocked and the air can't travel up the middle ear via the eustachian tube. Grommets can typically fall out, they normally do fall out 3 to 6 months, sometimes a year, especially these grommets. We call these the Shah grommets in the UK. Now, you can get some lifelong grommets or long-term grommets. They're called a T-tube, which is designed to be longer in the eardrum, a lot longer. But this is a Shah grommet, so it's probably been there for a while, and it's just hasn't been able to escape out the ear. So this normally, as it falls out the eardrum, and as the skin in the ear canal dies and sheds and moves sideways like a conveyor belt out of the ear, this grommet normally migrates out of the ear, just like if you had wax. Most people's earwax in the ear, it comes out naturally because the skin that the wax is sitting on, as that dies and sheds and moves sideways laterally out of the ear in a conveyor belt motion, it takes with it not only the wax, but a grommet, for example. But this grommet is stuck, it's trapped in this in a well. You can almost imagine, as I said to you before, this ear canal goes up and it suddenly goes down. It's almost like a well there, and it's stuck in the well. It's not going to come out. So I've just gone back in. The patient had a bit of a gag reflex again, so he coughed, so I just had to come out. And I'm just figuring out how we're going to do this, because it's so complex to remove this. There's hardly any space. And I did mention to the patient it could be that they would need to be referred back to ENT, who may have to put the patient with some maybe a general anaesthetic even, or at least a local anaesthetic where they can then start using some of their instruments like forceps and hooks. But if I put, as I said, a hook, I just couldn't get the hook in there. There's just no space. It's so cramped for space. And you can see this grommet it's lodged kind of down and to the left, and to, as I mentioned earlier, if I was to use forceps, the bottom jaw would graze the bottom of the ear canal, the isthmus region, and it will graze the left-hand side of the ear canal, because there's no other way I'm going to get the bottom jaw into that hole to pull it out. So for patient comfort, I'm continuing with the fine end, and I've managed to get a suction grip here, and I'm lifting this out of the well, out of the trench. You can see I'm going up and over, and slowly but surely I'm kind of pulling it out of this trench. But with a fine end, the suction grip's less powerful. So I'm just going to let you watch that. There's a few hairs there which can sometimes get in the way. So I think this is the full sucker. I've just had to go back in. I can just be really careful, lifting it out of that hole, out of the ear canal, and you'll see I've got some after shots as well. So here's a quick shot, but if you continue to watch in a moment, you'll get some more close-ups. So the patient's eardrum is intact, however, it's dull. You can see some yellow patches around in the middle of the eardrum. So the short process, the hammer bone, the top part, it's sucked. It's prominent, so the eardrum's sucked in. So the patient has got it's got glue ear again, and all that's fluid in there. And even the eardrum is so difficult to visualise because the ear canal's so narrow. It makes the visualisation of the eardrum very tricky. So there's some close-up shots of the grommet. You can see it's embedded itself in the wax. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video, guys. It's one of the more challenging ones, but it's something I really enjoyed doing today and helping the patient.